Welcome to Keat TV's Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast devoted to engaging with the ongoing revelation that reality is not what we've long assumed it to be. UAPs, UFOs, non-human intelligence, consciousness, philosophy, and high strangeness. These are the topics that keep me up at night, thinking, planning, dreaming, pondering the unknown in what amounts for me to be a suddenly re-enchanted world. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. A large part of my own personal epiphany surrounding the UFO, UAP, NHI question was a revelation best championed in recent years by Professor Diana Pasulka. This realization was simply that rather than being an intellectual wasteland of freaks and confabulators, the community of folks interested in and even interacting with these phenomena were the best and brightest, the most innovative of humanity's thinkers. And that, in fact, would have long been our most cherished scientific and technological geniuses often believed themselves to be in touch with and inspired by an outside intelligence. This has long been one of the engines of human evolution, and as things change, so they stay the same. To truly understand the breadth of this realization, we have to broaden our definition of NHI to include all visionary contacts with the other throughout history, including fairies, ghosts, gods, disembodied voices, psychedelic visionary exploration, etc. Some of this, of course, was ground first broken by the Dean of Ufology, Jacques Vallée. But to me and others, one of the most brilliant and holistic thinkers in this regard is our guest today, Joshua Cutchin. In particular, his Ecology of Souls, a phrase borrowed from Terence McKenna and a subject covered in his two-volume series of the same name, seems to encompass many of the contact experiences we've typically encountered as a species, and in it, Cutchin seeks to relate these phenomena to the notion of death, the afterlife, and the human soul. Thanks for joining us, Joshua.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I don't know if I'm worthy of it, but I'll sit here and hang.
Well, one of my passions lately has become this, book exploration that I do, where I go through books that are recommended to me or that have been, for instance, I heard about you through Jay from Inquire Anomalous, and he was basically rated you highly, said I should talk to you for my podcast. And then I saw your presentation this year at the event, and it was fantastic. And one of the things that primarily struck me about it was how it relates the phenomenon in some ways to death and the afterlife and the human soul, psychopomps, which I thought was a really interesting way to look at it. And I want to get there, but first I'd like to just ask you how you ended up in this space. Obviously, it seems like you're a trained academic. You a deep thinker, and for some people it might seem strange that you end up in a place where you're doing, as Jay likes to call it, anomalous studies. What led you here?
Well, that's certainly a decision once you decide to throw yourself into this field. A lot of conventional job pursuits get barred along the way because you've sullied your name with the UFO topic. But I grew up in a household that was quite luckily very open to just all sorts of strange things. I found out years later that my father was actually subscribed to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization newsletter. So I guess it runs in the family to a certain degree. But, by all other metrics, we were a very, conventional Christian family. But the attitude was when I would pick up a book on Bigfoot or the occasional book on UFOs, even though that wasn't my thing when I was very young, the idea, the consensus among my parents was, well, at least he's reading. So that was sort of the crucible in which I was formed. That and the fact that I was an absolute lover of monster movies, and still to this day, Stan Winston is a name that I cherish as much as any Hollywood blockbuster creator. So I've always sort of had that line of interest, and over the years, I sort of have come to and left these topics in terms of my interest. It really peaked in 2012, I believe, was when I got my first desk job. I jumped around from career path to career path. I have a master's in journalism and a master's in music history, more or less. And I ended up working at my day job as a public affairs director for the School of Music at the University of Georgia. And it was an hour commute each way. And, that sort of 2012 to 2015 timeframe. I know that there are a lot of paranormal podcasts, and some of them are quite excellent, like this show today. But at that time, I still view that as sort of like the Wild West of paranormal podcasting because there were just so many cool ideas that were coming out. And I really started re-immersing myself in these topics, and it was actually that which brought me back to the UFO topic in seriousness. Because my biggest problem with the UFO topic has historically been the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Sure.
If you are to believe a lot of these stories, we have 15 different races of ET visiting us in 10,000 different craft designs. And that always seemed to be really violative of Occam's razor in terms of multiplying variables unnecessarily. But once I learned that there was an alternative line of scholarship that focused on things like altered states of consciousness, or even, dare I say, a more spiritual interpretation or metaphysical interpretation of the UFO phenomenon, that was when I was like, oh, I can see how this can work now. So I was really getting re-immersed in all that, and at the time, I also was gifted an Amazon gift card by my sister-in-law, and I said, I'm going to buy a Bigfoot book. It's been a while since I bought a Bigfoot book. And the book that I bought was J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. It's an excellent book. It talks about Bigfoot beliefs amongst indigenous tribes on the coast of Alaska. And in that particular book, it mentions that if you were to take food from the Bakwus, one of the Bigfoot analogs, and you were to eat the food that the Bakwus has given you, you'd be trapped with the Bakwus forever. And I said, that sounds an awful lot like Western European fairy folklore, where if you take
Absolutely.
food in
Yeah.
fairyland, you're trapped there. Yeah. And it was just such a striking, direct comparison between these two uh, bits of mythology that never really have any reason to exist alongside one another. It was such a specific prohibition that I said, wow, somebody should really write a book comparing those two. And I sort of waited and I was like, nobody's written this book. Am I being called, I'm being called to write it. So yeah. So anyway, that was the genesis for my first book, A Trojan Feast. And much to my surprise, that book was really well received. I was working with a publisher, Patrick Weege at Anomalous Books, whose writing I had read since I was in middle school. So it was kind of like, oh, well, this community's been really welcoming and they seem to value what I have to say. And it's all been downhill or uphill from there, depending on how you look at it. And my latest nonfiction book is indeed Ecology of Souls, which is a real snapshot of how I tend to view these phenomena currently. The sort of mythopoetic version that has as much to say about us as it does about these phenomena distinctly on their own.
Yeah, it seems like it comes from a rather grand tradition of people in this the field. People like Peter Levenda, or where you basically take a global snapshot and you do a real, a fantastic job of analyzing the different filaments and comparing them and finding commonalities that make people have to wonder at what point were these related, are they related, or are they simply different attempts at describing the same phenomenon? One of the things that you do really well that I think a lot of folks in this space don't is that your approach is in a lot of ways global, and you pay a lot of respect to cultures that are normally left out of these conversations, or they're given sort of glib, they're included in a sort of glib way where it's just a generality, but you actually get into like the Native American traditions. Like you talk about the Yurok tribe having a particular slice of their mythology that seems to resonate with this whole conversation. The Yuroks happen to be the tribe by where I live in Northern California, so that struck me as one particular example. But you also cover folklore from Africa and from a lot of different places. To get away from the UAP subject for just a second, how did you go about researching this? Was this something where you had slowly researched this over your life and kind of had this knowledge natively, or did you specifically go out and research all of these topics for this particular one book project?
Well, I do strongly believe that if there's any truth to this phenomenon, and obviously I'm sitting here talking to you, so I think there is some truth to it,
Yeah.
then every culture has something to say about it.
Yeah.
And since so many aspects of it still remain unexplained, I tend to entertain a lot of different interpretations of this. So yeah, I have a passing interest in anthropology. I have kind of a relatively large library behind me. I also have a relatively large set of electronic resources of books that are out of print and whatnot. But really, the thing about Ecology of Souls was that this project was something that I had been thinking about longer than anything else. The thing that had really always stuck in my mind was that famous quote from Anne Strieber, wife of Whitley Strieber,
Yeah.
the world's most famous alien abductee. She was answering correspondence between Whitley and people who had read Communion who were also experiencers, and she made the remark that this has something to do with what we call death. And that's such a poignant and, quite frankly, left field interpretation of the UFO question that I just couldn't shake that. And then you've got alongside that these stories of people who encounter dead loved ones, either aboard supposed craft or during periods of heavy UFO activity in their own lives. And it does seem that there's something to that. So I was thinking about this topic for literally years, and just sort of like putting mental pins and things here and there. Um, and that was a lot of the backbone for it. And the project came together quite quickly. I believe it was something like 18 months from sitting down to research to having it finished. So it was for a work this big, it came together really quickly. And part of me thinks that's because I was thinking about it for a long time. Part of me thinks that it's because I have a lot of support from family and colleagues. Um, but also, I think it came together quickly because there is this thread connecting all these different things. So
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if that really necessarily answers your question, but
Yeah.
I've often said that I have a really good retention for this stuff when I can't tell you what my children ate 2 nights ago. You know what I mean? Like for some reason that goes into my brain and right back out, but I can tell you the details about what one person said about one specific UFO sighting for some reason. So,
Yeah.
sort of a combination of factors. But I think that there are a lot of electronic resources online too that people don't quite. I think there's a lot of resources online that people can utilize to look for this stuff in a better way. I mean, Google Books has its shortcomings, but if you need to find just one sentence from a book, it can actually be quite a powerful tool. So once you start leveraging all the tools at your disposal, then it sort of does come together to form this holistic picture.
Yeah. And that, I mean, says nothing about the arguments that you're making, which I think are part of the most brilliant part about your book. So I think that can solely be laid at your feet. So take the blame for the brilliant argumentation that you make in there.
Well,
Uh,
thank you.
but one of the things that I noticed and that I've been covering sort of relatively recently, I had actually attempted to interview Ray Hernandez, and we had some technical issues, so that interview has been put off for a little while until he can get he's living somewhere where there's not easy internet access, yada yada. But one of the things that he talks about, and so does Kenneth Ring and a lot of people that he's associated with, is this idea of the different contact modalities. And it seems like that's, to my mind, a different way of saying the ecology of souls. They're both kind of going toward the same argument. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not you're familiar with that, the contact modalities, and what exactly, how would you define what the ecology of souls is in relation to either UAP or anything else?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of what Ray was able to pull together with the free study, and
Yeah,
it's just such a landmark work in terms of uh, getting a real 10,000-foot look at these phenomena. And that term contact modalities I actually use throughout Ecology of Souls
yeah,
because it is a context-free way to describe these encounters. Every other sort of language you could use is going to be sort of clunky or it's going to be filled with associations that you don't want. You can say paranormal encounters or supernatural encounters, but then you're bringing in stuff like synchronicity, which granted it does get talked about, but I'm talking about like encounters with intelligences. But then you say encounters with intelligences, and that's clunky too. So, kudos to him for coming up with the terminology contact modalities. Yeah, I had a lot of moments while writing Ecology of Souls where I would say to myself, is this something that even needs to be written? Because as you alluded to, the comparisons between alien abductions and near-death experiences had been made at length by Kenneth Ring. Similarities between shamanic initiations and the cultures that practice shamanism and the alien abduction experience have been made at length by Eddie Bullard, who I think is one of the great unsung heroes of ufology. But I think what Ecology of Souls does is it well, first of all, it broadens and deepens those connections in a lot of ways. I think there's some stuff that didn't necessarily go discussed in those, bodies of work by those two individuals. But also just putting these things in dialogue with one another, it so that you can see that, well, of course, the shamanic initiation looks like the alien abduction because shamanic initiations often are near-death experiences, and they also have this connection with the fairy folk who had this strong association worldwide, I would argue, but especially in Western Europe, to the human dead. So you sort of start to get this sort of, again, that high resolution, high altitude picture of what might be going on. As far as what Ecology of Souls is meant to embody, it's something that I struggled with throughout the creation of this book because I do think that what we're driving at when we look at the UFO question in a really intellectually honest way is sort of a it's modernity's attempt to grapple with animism. And animism isn't a great term. Some anthropologists have stopped using that term because it's embedded in this very, 19th century idea of what mind is, and there are connotations of the people who practice it being primitive or superstitious, and so that's a word that you don't necessarily want to use. So what do you replace that with? Because the core idea, the idea that everything is ensouled, and not just living things being ensouled, but landscapes and weather patterns and household objects being ensouled, I think that's a useful idea, especially if you're looking at the direction that some interpretations of reality are going. Interpretations like the model of idealism,
Yeah.
these models that reject materialism. It's a great idea, this animistic idea, but it has a lot of baggage to it. So I think Ecology of Souls is could serve as a placeholder for that. And it's this idea that there is a a soup of soul energy. I mean, see, the words you start to use sound so cheesy
Yeah, I
when you
mean, but
talk about this
yeah,
stuff,
I understand
but
that.
there, there's a soup. So, fully embracing the cheesiness, there's a soup of soul energy that we go to and return from ad infinitum,
Mhm.
and that seems to be, I think, what is hinted at by nature of the fact that so many of these different topics have to do with the paranormal. Because while comparisons have been made between shamanism and near-death experiences and alien abductions and the fairy literature, I was so surprised to find that this idea of death and what it means to transition did extend into things like ley lines. It
Mhm.
did extend into ideas of ancient monuments. It even extends into the cryptozoological area, even though a lot of cryptozoologists don't want to really acknowledge that because they're very much of that 19th century um, bag it and tag it sort of model of understanding these things. But yeah, so if I felt like Ecology of Souls was not only a nice way to honor Terence McKenna, who has been an influential figure on the way that I think. I won't even say on my worldview, but on the way that I think.
Yeah.
I sort of listen to a Terence McKenna lecture once a year to sort of reorient myself a bit. Um, so it's not only an homage to McKenna and what he was talking about with the DMT space, which again looks a lot like some of these near-death experiences, but also is perhaps a way to have a model to move discussion not only of animism forward, but also discussion of the UFO phenomenon. And if I could hope for Ecology of Souls, the book series, the two books with the companion, which is just the reference material. If I could hope for Ecology of Souls to have some sort of legacy, if I might be that pretentious, it would be that people would entertain this idea alongside things like the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis and the extraterrestrial hypothesis and the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. You can't really call it the dead hypothesis. That's not very elegant. But if you call it the Ecology of Souls hypothesis, that gets a little bit more in the proper direction. And that I feel like that's more appropriate than saying the dead hypothesis because the book is just as much about rebirth and the cycle between birth and death and life as it is about death itself.
One of the fascinating parts about that particular argument that you're making is that the other is us then. I mean, basically, it's us later on, it's us in a transformed state, but ultimately it comes from the same consciousness of which we're a part. And I think that is a fascinating argument to make, especially given the strange but symbolic way that these things seem to want to try and communicate with us. Like they seem to want to do it on a symbolic level that involves a lot of deep psyche, work. Whether it's like trying to get people to certain epiphanies about the nature of reality or whatever else, there seems to be a message that they're trying to convey to us, and that seems to make the most sense if it's actually us talking back to us. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a prescient way to look at it. I would sort of pull back a little bit from saying that it is us. Obviously, I do think that that's a huge component of it, but I think if you're using an ecology of souls model, it implies that the souls of everything
Sure. Yeah.
is
Yeah.
dumped into this ocean on the other side. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure distinctions between the human world and the non-human world and the spirit world necessarily become as useful when you're talking about that. I mean, it's one of the biggest problems that people have with reincarnation. They say, well, if reincarnation is really the way that the afterlife and the world works, then why do we have more people on planet Earth than at any other point in history? And it's like, well, how many waves can be on an ocean? It's like they can have an infinite amount, but it also implies that it's all mixed up, which I think is why you get these stories of, 15 people being the reincarnation of Queen Cleopatra is because, well, maybe parts of whatever that is got mixed up and redistributed. I mean, obviously this is speculative,
Sure.
but so I do think that there is something about this phenomenon which is a mirror back to us, and I think that it plays with, as you alluded to, our cultural and societal expectations, our cultural and societal experiences, our cultural and societal symbolism. I think symbolism and theater seem to be the lingua franca of the UFO phenomenon, and I think it's an important thing to acknowledge. Similarly, like I'm not saying that aliens are dead people, but they might be. It really is telling that so much of our UFO literature is filled with stories of gray aliens, which I can make a case for being the dead, but I won't right now. But a lot of UFO contact over the years has been either beings that look like human beings or beings of light, which, or both of those are staples of the near death experiences as well.
Yeah.
I saw something on Twitter the other day that was like, well, why if near death experiences and UFO encounters are, related, then why don't we see more grays in near death experiences? And I'm like, you're kind of telling us that you don't really know that much about the UFO literature because
Yeah.
beings, I mean, you alluded to the free study. The free study with Ray Hernandez suggests that beings of light are perhaps more common than gray aliens in these UFO assumed experiences, I guess I should say. So there does seem to be a lot of mixing and matching, and it's part of the reason that the books became books as opposed to a book,
Yeah.
because it just the more you look at this, the more that in the interest of intellectual honesty, you have to engage with a lot of different ideas, and it just sort of grows and grows and grows until you're like, oh, this is 260,000 words. How am I gonna get this? How am I get this from the computer into physical space? That's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's a lot of words, by the way, for people who don't write or, I mean, that's a lot of words.
it's too many, I would argue, but at the same
Yeah.
time,
No, I didn't think so.
well, you have to step back and you'd be like, well, you're talking about death, and it's like the biggest mystery of all.
Yeah.
But also to your extent, to your point about this being somehow us. I mean, time plays some sort of factor in this phenomenon.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
book is long enough as it is, as we've alluded to, that I didn't really tackle time, but I had a lot of interesting conversations with Dr. Masters at the New York event that you alluded to.
Yeah.
His one of his working theories is that these are us from the future. And I said to him, I said, at first, your hypothesis and my hypothesis seem diametrically opposed, but I think they have a lot more in common
Yeah.
than than we realize, because how we view these things as ancestors or descendants is really dependent upon where on this timeline we are, or time circle as it might be. I'm not really sure. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting scholarship pointing in that direction.
Now, your books seem to me to be a survey of a lot of different mythologies and points that sort of tie all this together. But I'm wondering if you have, in the course of your research, settled on what you think the mission is of the UFO NHI psychopomp, and maybe we should explain what that term is. But I mean, that was one of the things that you posited at the Inquire Anomalous talk about, and a lot of people were really fascinated by that. So maybe could you go into that a little bit?
Right. Well, part of the frustration when I talk about this is it's like, well, I did spend so many words talking about this that if I present it in any other format, it's going to seem like it's a really shallow
Yeah,
interpretation and opens up a
absolutely.
lot of questions.
So I recommend the
The
book. The book is the way
yeah,
to really get the meat of this. But
the basic idea is that there are these figures that we all know, but we don't really discuss in modern culture, of psychopomps that are the guides of human souls from this life into the afterlife. And everyone knows what a psychopomp is. Just think about the Grim Reaper, and now imagine that template being sort of uh, fitted to every culture
Mhm.
and society that has existed through time
And it's been a
on planet
consistent
Earth.
thing. I mean, they are
Oh,
in all
super.
the cultures. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there
Yeah,
is.
and with them you get a lot of consistent themes of, like, they tend to carry wands or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that looks like a wand, which is a hallmark of the UFO occupant literature. But they are threshold deities. They're liminal. They're tricksterish. Um, they're often therianthropes, half human, half animal. So it's got a lot of the things that we would expect to see from the UFO phenomenon, and it's not really a new idea because Carl Jung, in his essay on flying saucers, even said, the idea that the flying saucer might function as a sort of Karen, the Greek ferryman over the river Styx, might function as a sort of Karen is something that I've not encountered in the literature thus far. And now, 50 some odd years later,
Here it
70 some
is.
odd years later, here we are. Yeah, finally got around to it. But the idea that you can make a case with the associations between death and the UFO phenomenon that you could interpret the occupants, or quite frankly the craft themselves, as psychopomps, or at least embodying psychopomp themes. I mean,
Mhm,
another really prominent psychopomp symbol is the idea of the boat.
mhm. Yeah.
Think about the end of the Lord of the Rings, right? When they sail to the Undying Lands, and so you're like, did Frodo die, or did he? Where's he go? He basically died, right? Because it's a boat to an unreachable realm. We've always associated boats with travels to the afterlife. Our ancestors, pretty much regardless of where you trace your lineage, either used canoes as coffins, or they, buried alongside their royalty boats, as grave goods, or they, made effigies of boats out of stone above burials. Like, this is an ancient motif. And similarly, the UFO phenomenon is a phenomenon that's entirely preoccupied with transportation, right? Where are they going? Where do they come from? Where are they taking me? All these questions crop up time and time again. And once you start to view it as in that context, coupled with all this just anecdotal evidence from experiencers who are talking about these spiritual experiences and seeing dead loved ones, and UFOs appearing around the time of death. I mean, that's a minor motif that really should be discussed. And then the intense, the intensity of frequency where these death lights are seen, these ghost lights are seen amongst, again, all indigenous cultures worldwide, pretty much. Associate these anomalous lights as omens of death, and in some cases, that's how the human soul is conceptualized, as an orb of light. And you look at how many UFO encounters either involve orbs of light, or place an extreme emphasis on light, and it starts to form sort of a holistic picture. You had said something else before that, and I was going to put a pin in it and come back to it, and I completely forgot what it was. Well, something else along the lines of all this that we're talking about.
I'm not sure.
Part of your question, yeah. Sorry about that.
No
But
worries. No, I was basically one thing I asked that I don't know if you got to there was what you think the mission of the UFO
oh, that's
phenomenon
exactly it.
is based on all the absurdities. I mean, you get all of this stuff, whether they're serving pancakes or, I mean, there's a long list of weird things that go on. I mean, what do you think that is communicating as toward the motive and mission of what the phenomenon may or may not be?
Well, thank you so much for remembering that, because
No problem.
that's exactly what I was trying to recall. Um, yes, so I have a hesitancy, and I kind of fear this about what I see in Ecology of Souls being reflected back in myself.
Mhm.
My mentor, Greg Bishop, has always encouraged me to sort of keep a flexible interpretation of the phenomenon, because brittle fixed interpretations are brittle and they're likely to break, right? So
Yeah.
I I at the same time, I find the Ecology of Souls hypothesis really attractive, and obviously I would, because I wrote it. But I hesitate to apply a mission to the UFO phenomenon. If I do, it has to get a little bit esoteric and philosophical, quite frankly. The first thing that I would say is that if you look at a lot of these different experiences, and this is the takeaway from many UFO experiencers, is there is a recurring refrain that I like to call dying to death.
Hmm.
And this is best seen in something like the use of uh, pharmacological substances like psilocybin in terminal patients. They take it and then they literally die to death. They no longer fear death. Similarly, you could argue that something was going on with the Eleusinian mysteries. I would argue that that's the primary point of most religions and spiritualities, is to find a way to die to death so that you can no longer be afraid of death and come away with an increased sense of purpose for making this existence better, because it takes all the pressure off of whatever's going to happen, that sort of existential dread. And that's another refrain that you hear, from the near-death experiencers, and as again illustrated in the free survey, um, something that you also see with people who are longitudinally inclined alien abductees. So I think that that might be part of it, is just as a reminder. I mean, I've started saying now lately, um, regarding the UFO, I'm not sure that there's a there, but I know that there's a there here, and um, the profundity of change that you see in people who have these experiences, I think, is really worth noting. As you alluded to in your introduction, the reenchantment aspect, I think, is
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah.
I mean, even if I don't go out, every some nights I go out and check the mail and it's dark outside and I look up in the sky, I'm like, maybe I'll see a UFO. And of course I haven't yet. But at the same time, I'm taking the time to look at the stars and I'm seeing things, and it does have that sort of re-enchanting quality. The other thing that I would say that I've come to suspect about the UFO, and this is something that has been alluded to by, again, minds greater than mine, but the UFO is kind of a confrontation, whatever it is. It forces you to confront aspects of yourself. And in some ways, it might be seen as speaking to shadow integration in Jungian
Yes,
psychology. But
absolutely. That's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It
But
seems
it's
almost to be
it's
speaking a Jungian language in a lot of ways.
oh, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah,
and it's a catalyst for that. So if you're highly scientific, it makes you confront that. If you're highly metaphysical, it makes you confront that. If you feel lonely, it makes you confront that. If you feel hopeful that we'll be saved by space people, it kind of makes you confront that too, and
yeah,
the darker abductions too. So whatever it is, if you take the time to seriously look at the UFO phenomenon, you will experience some change. You will experience an alchemical transformation, and you will become a different person. I mean, I don't want to. It's hard for me to say this because I'm afraid it's going to sound like, look at how great I am. But like, I feel like I have become a better rounded person by looking at UFOs.
yeah.
The example, again, an example that I've been using recently is, I went, I believe it was last year at this point, to a children's museum with my twin boys, and I got trapped in the geology exhibit. I'm like, I know some people are really into geology. If that's your thing, I'm not hating on it. It's just never really interested me. But I was staring at, one of the display cases, and there was something in one of the display cases, and I can't even tell you what it was, but I did this mental exercise, or it came flooding to me, I'm not sure which, where I was able to relate what I was seeing in the display case to something else, to something else, to something else, to something else, to something supernatural or paranormal. And that made it interesting for me. So again, it speaks to that re-enchantment, but it also speaks to me taking up an interest in topics that I never normally would. I mean, another quote that I'm fond of saying lately is this quote that Ami Michel said to Jacques Vallée at one point. He said, ufology is not a scientific discipline so much as it is an initiation. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it's the only area of academic pursuit where you start off looking at case reports and you end up reading about Arab mystics. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly it. Like, if you had approached me with some of the things that I'm interested in, a Jungian book on my shelf about psyche and death, like if you'd approached me with that 15 years ago, I'd have been like, what is this? This doesn't interest me. But now it does. And
Yeah.
I think that makes a life better lived, to be interested in this diversity of topics, quite frankly.
Yeah, I have to say that my journey has exactly mirrored what you're saying. Whereas I had started off reading UFOs and Generals by Leslie Kean, and then all of a sudden I'm like, knee deep in philosophy and all kinds of things that I never would have really approached otherwise. But now I'm like devouring them. I mean, it's not even like I'm just moderately interested, like your book. Like, I've spent hours upon hours reading these books, and I feel like I'm a better person having read them, and the world has suddenly restored some of the romance that science I mean, I'm totally pro science. I mean, who isn't, right? I mean, I think that it's,
Right.
but at the same time, I think that it's made it so that we can no longer look at the world with a sense of wonder and only the expectation that at some point in the future, it's all going to be rendered banal. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
it's a collision of electrons or particles, and therefore there's no sense of mystery, there's no sense of holistic belonging, there's no metaphysical home there. And I
Right.
think that ufology, or the subject in general, which gets into, like you said, the afterlife and all these other questions, I think it gives one permission to re-engage with the world in a way that's a lot more fulfilling. And I think that that is, the miracle that it's worked in my life, and I deeply appreciate that, regardless of what the reality of it is. You know, it's almost like, I mean, like they talk about how ufology might be the recreation of a myth, of the modern myth. Well, it's giving us permission to be mythological in our thinking, which I think is a very powerful way to engage with the world, and one we're sorely lacking, you know?
No, I completely agree. And it's kind of interesting because the actual scientists that I know, who do that as a living,
Yeah,
um, they still retain a lot of this wonder because they realize they grasp the complexity of the systems that they're dealing with, right?
yeah.
But as we, who aren't doing science as a profession, hear science trickling down, there is a tendency to think, oh, well, everything's been explained and there's nothing to, it just all works because it just does. But so I think it's a matter of perspective that really helps. And yeah, I think that science is really important to everything. But I also think that we need to be very careful as we see the popularization of UFOs being taken up by scientific sources, that we keep pace in the humanities alongside that.
Yeah.
But, folks like Dr. Pasulka that you mentioned, folks like Dr. Jeff Kripal, I think are doing a really good job of trotting their horses alongside the scientists and saying, "Hi, we're here too. We need to keep up. We're going to keep up with you." Um, because again, I think there is such a human element to it, and I think that even if if you approach the UFO topic intellectually honestly, um, you're going to run into some real confrontations with the way that we view the world. And I would say primarily a confrontation with the materialist paradigm. If you throw out the number of UFO encounters, from abductions to even lights in the sky, that involve telepathy, you're not going to be left with a lot of encounters.
Yeah.
And if telepathy exists, this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of, I can think of at least five scientific philosophers. If telepathy exists, then something about physicalism or materialism is wrong. And if something about physicalism or materialism is wrong, then we have to reconsider kind
Everything.
of everything.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah, and sort of downgrade some of the laws of physics and laws of nature to tendencies,
Hmm.
to guidelines
Yeah.
of nature and guidelines of physics. And to that extent, I'd like to address this, even though we haven't necessarily brought it up, but I think this might be a good juncture to do so.
Yeah.
The most common pushback that I get from people who uh, hear my opinions on the UFO phenomenon will say, "Well, spirits and ghosts and the dead, they don't crash spaceships. We've got crashed spaceships." And it's like, okay, well, maybe we do. It certainly seems like we've got something. Um, but I would reserve judgment on that, indicating that the phenomenon is extraterrestrial. I think we have done ourselves a great disservice in the modern West, separating things into physical and spiritual categories, and never the twain shall meet. These
Yes.
boundaries, I think, are a lot more porous than we appreciate. A good example of that would be um, the fact that ghosts seem to leave footprints and slam doors. They are immaterial, but they're interacting with the physical world. Similarly, if you look at the work of, folks like Dean Radin, who have done some excellent work in the
Yes.
laboratory,
Absolutely.
ironclad, in my opinion.
Hmm.
I'm aware of the criticisms, but ironclad work in the laboratory demonstrating the reality of psi phenomena. Well, that's an internal phenomenon that interacts with the external world. So our definition of physical and non-physical is a little bit backwards. And to that extent, I would suggest the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that we might look at crash debris, alleged biological material, through a lens that is more consistent with apports and poltergeist phenomena and in
Hmm.
seances,
Yeah.
the things that materialize out of nowhere, or fairy flags and fairy boots that you find, strewn throughout Western Europe. in some reliquaries. And speaking of reliquaries, saints relics. You'll
Hmm.
go to these different places where, oh, we have the finger of Saint so and so, and if you take a tally, you're like, well, this person had 25 fingers, so that doesn't quite make sense. So obviously, there's some aspect of deception there, but people experience miraculous things from these saints relics sometimes.
Absolutely.
So our understanding, I think that's the real linchpin, that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about things like crash debris and the possibility that this phenomenon can have a psychic component. The other thing I'm fond of saying, which I said at the New York talk, was human beings are predominantly physical with a psychic component. I suspect that the UFO is predominantly psychic with a physical component as well.
Yeah.
And anybody who tells you that they're all one or the other, I think, is incorrect. And that's a mistake that I made early on in my assessment of the phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the evidence that it's left behind is so complex that nailing it down to any one of those categories is kind of a fool's errand, because in order to do so, you've got to discount so much testimony and so much evidence that, in the end, I mean, yeah. Anyway.
Right. Well, and to that degree as well, the UFO slash UAP question. I'm still old fashioned. I keep saying UFO. The UAP question is probably answered by 15 different things. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
it might a component of it might be extraterrestrial, a component of it might be, large scale psi phenomena, a component of it might be mundane and we just haven't cataloged it yet, some sort of meteorological phenomenon, in addition to misidentifications and all sorts of stuff. It probably has a multitude of answers to the question, which is something that is important to remember and something that I fall into the trap of not doing as well myself. So
Yeah, and the danger of that is that if you go and you dedicate yourself to one explanation or definition, if someone happens to disprove that one UFO sighting was not that thing, then by connection, people are going to be like, aha, the whole thing has been debunked. And it's like, well, no,
right.
that particular one might not have been this particular definition, but you haven't scuttled the whole argument. And people, I mean, debunkers try to do that anyway, so it's,
Right.
you're not going to
Well,
convince them to do it otherwise.
and that's why, I have heard some criticisms that my books get a little bit repetitive when I hammer home the same point with 5 or 6 cases, but that's part of what that is, right? It's insurance and saying, well, like, I don't know the I don't know the validity of any one of these cases, but just in case, here's a way to demonstrate that this is a theme more than it is resting on a linchpin of a single case. I think
Yeah.
that's a big mistake. Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was there has been this pervasive idea in this topic and spirituality in general and whatnot that we're sort of undergoing an evolution of consciousness, and that the UFO or the UAP slash the breadth of that related phenomenon is all meant to kind of help push us along that evolutionary trail. I find that a fascinating argument. I don't know that it's true, but there seems like there were times in the past where we knew more, and you mentioned the Eleusinian mysteries and Hermeticism and those types of things that seem to hint at there being a deeper knowledge about the nature of life and death and whatnot. Do you think that we're in the middle of like an evolutionary arc that is the point? And if so, what do you think the end destination might look like? Or is this just us once again wrestling with a perennial presence that we kind of have forgotten about, so we have to come back to it and touch bases? I mean, any
I
thoughts?
mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea of this representing an evolutionary jump forward. I've read that sentiment in Kenneth Ring with his work with the NDEs, where he talked about omega prototypes, and I'm aware of that being addressed in Jeff and Whitley's book, The Supernatural, where they say, I mean, I love it. It's an elegant turn of phrase. This is perhaps what the force of evolution looks like when it's exerted upon an animal that can recognize it. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's really compelling, and I literally just got chills saying that. But at the same time, in my gut, I feel like this is tied to things like uh, the constant growth models of capitalism, or this idea that civilizations always progress from primitive to advanced, and there isn't any backtracking or pitfalls, or that we even have a good definition of primitive to advanced. I see a lot of problems with that idea that, like, oh, well, it's just getting better and we're growing and it's going all in one direction and it's an arrow that's going in that direction. There's no need to reflect on what's happened in the past. There's no need to consider whether or not we're on the right course, because the UFO is confirming our evolutionary sympathies. And I just don't feel that's the case. I feel like the UFO probably is a call back to putting humanity back into right relation with its environment.
Yeah,
I mean, I think,
that's a good point.
uh, well, completely circumstantially. I mean, you look at the modern flying saucer era. Obviously, this phenomenon has been with us since we have had language, at least, I think. But if you look at sort of what people want to call the start of the flying saucer area, it coincides with the creation of the most destructive force ever seen on this planet. You know, alternative historians' ideas of other doomsday devices notwithstanding, the atom bomb was something that has the potential, and still does, especially in 2024, geez, to completely end life on this planet. And that just so happens to be when the saucers really stood up and said, "Hi, hi, pay attention to us." So I tend to think that it is a callback to these older modalities of respecting our each other, respecting the earth, respecting the world. That animist idea, really, and the fact that it so closely does look like shamanic initiation, and the fact that the messages that people who are taken aboard these craft do receive are oftentimes environmental messages, oftentimes compassionate messages. I see it not so much as a catalyst pushing us forward, but a call back to what we have lost uh, in our current, modern age.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the questions that also comes up a lot of times in these encounters is technology. I mean, and it sort of relates to what you were saying about the nukes. I mean, that's obviously a huge technological leap forward that we've made, and it's an unfortunate leap. And there has been a lot of arguments made that basically, humanity has lost touch with its spiritual side through the advent of technology. And that's going on even as we are entering uncharted territories with AI and what that's going to represent to humanity, and whether that's like, are we creating our own sort of collective consciousness or our own sort of God through technological means, and how dangerous is that? But at the same time, I mean, you mentioned earlier the space people are going to come rescue us. That's part of the technological message
Right,
as well.
right.
Trying to distill any single meme or idea out of all of the sightings and all of the encounters is probably impossible. But do you think that there's anything you could distill out of the message about technology that may be conveyed by some of this?
Well, I think the primary thing is that our understanding of what technology is kind of backwards. We think of silica and metal and electricity as being prerequisites for anything we would call technology, but I think that there are a lot of different technologies that exist. We just don't think of
Absolutely.
them in the same way.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
talking about entheogens and plant medicines like ayahuasca. I'm talking about meditation as being a
Meditation. Yeah,
technology.
absolutely.
Um, and that's you hear this alluded to even in some of the most nutsy and boltsy of crash retrieval stories, where the aliens control the ships with their minds. It's like, well, obviously there's an aspect of this technologically that we're not we're not quite understanding. I do think something that's interesting about the sort of rise of AI, and in something I'm trying to sort of plant the seeds of to see if we can keep an eye out for, is that I would argue that the UFO occupants and fairies from fairy folklore, and I mean that globally, not just Western Europe, are the same, or at least similar, if
Mhm.
not the same thing. And that
Yeah.
there is a mask that's being reapplied. And that's a whole discussion that we could have. It would take us probably another 45 minutes. Um, but like if you do the work and you look at it, you'll see strong comparisons to be made in both those separate mythologies. So there does seem to be a mask that gets updated, and it was once spirits, and then it was fairies, and then it kind of put on the demon mask as Christianity took hold, and nowadays it's the UFO occupant, whatever brand it might be.
Yeah.
And I wonder, it feels like we're overdue for
A
a
shift.
costume change.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
It's
I kind of wonder if we're not going to start seeing the narrative, or at least the interpretation of whatever is behind those masks, changing into being like, oh, it was the AI consciousness distributed their robot sentries in the middle of the night to take me to their underground processing server room, the underground server room. I wonder if the flavor of these narratives isn't going to change as sort of our anxieties continue to shift um,
yeah.
to,
That's
to to the world that we've created. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's interesting because in Pasulka's novel, one of her subjects talks about the possibility that the other is AI, and maybe even an AI that's working itself backward through time. And then you talk about Philip K. Dick and his exegesis with basically his notion that Valis was
Yep.
this thing that was floating out in just off the planet and sort of helping to control the development of humanity, but it ultimately being an AI. And those are fun things to think about. But I mean, it's again, like with so much else in this topic, that's one thing that's frustrating, but it also keeps you seeking, right? I mean, there's no answers that you can fall on and say, this is it. But then that's what keeps you open to the exploration, which is really the transformative part of it.
Well, and that would be sort of my mandate for anyone listening to this. If I could encourage you to do one thing, it would be to have a very small basket in your head that says, this is absolute truth, and a very small basket in your head that says, this is absolutely false, and to have a gigantic basket in your head that says, interesting if true. Have a big
Yeah.
baby, a big baby basket, a big maybe basket in your head in which to file this stuff, and to be able to sit with contradictory ideas, and to be able to sit with multiple possibilities being on the table. I think is a useful thing when you're treading in these waters, because so much of it remains speculation. Beyond the fact that there is something happening and that it
Exactly.
uh, does seem possessed of miraculous abilities, that's about as far as you can go um, in terms of saying absolutes about this phenomenon. And obviously, there are some people that would contest even that. So a lot of things remain on the table, and be wary of those, including myself, who claim that they have the answer pinned down, because it's still very much a mystery. And there are some tendencies and some trends and some connections, but exactly what it is still a pretty wide open question.
Yeah, I mean, and that's been mostly my approach, is to take in things that even if I don't agree with them, I hold them in my mind as a point of information that I can refer back to, and kind of every once in a while check it against the templates to see if they're fitting or not. Um, Last question, we've got about 5 more minutes. I wanted to ask you about the current disclosure conversation. Obviously, we've been watching Fitzpatrick make a skeptics tour of Green Street's hate blog and everything else, talking about why all this is garbage, but at the same time, I've been convinced by what I've seen that something is in fact going on. Where are you at in that? Are you frustrated as well, or do you think that whole idea of there being disclosure, especially from the government, is
Right.
whatever, useless?
Again, for the final hour of our discussion, we're going to talk about
I know,
disclosure.
I know. Here's the huge
Now,
question right at the end.
so people who have followed me over the years might be a little bit surprised by this, but I have softened considerably on the disclosure movement, partially because I think I had a misinterpretation of what their goals were. I thought that the goals were saying, here's the phenomenon, it is extraterrestrial, they come from Zebel Ganubi, here's Ambassador Kleborp, to
Yeah,
help
yeah.
us. Um, but I no longer think that's the goal. I think the goal is to have the American people land at a similar conclusion that they have with the Kennedy assassination, which is that something strange happened. Don't
Yeah.
know what happened, but like, we are not getting all of the story. And I think that's the goal of the disclosure movement in regards to the UFO question. So to that end, I'm much more sympathetic than I once was. I would also emphasize that a lot of the people who are pushing for disclosure, um, they're not sitting around reading Bob Lazar and Phil Corso. They're reading weird books.
Yeah,
They're reading the weird books that we've been talking about.
exactly right.
A couple of them are reading Ecology of Souls. I said it not to brag, but I said it just to say that, like, the people who are read into this acknowledge the strangeness of this phenomenon. So if your disclosure doesn't acknowledge the strangeness and the confronting aspects of what reality is, or what you are as a human being, then it's a partial disclosure at best. So that's something else to keep in mind. At the same time, with this newfound respect that I do have for the disclosure movement, um, I'm also not very optimistic about any sort of consensus really being reached. And I was at a conference back in August, um, and I asked the room. I said, "Imagine the person that you didn't vote for in the last election. They're now president, and they're telling you that UFOs are real. Do you believe them?" and and that's the thing. I think that
Yeah.
we're in this sort of post-truth world, because no matter who is put into positions of authority, there's going to be a faction that really disagrees with them on a fundamental level and is not going to believe a word that they say. So I don't know if that's even an attainable goal at this point in 2024. But I mean, everyone's welcome to try.
Yeah. It's interesting. Part of my thinking has been like, as we've gone through these hearings and whatnot, and we get into the conversation of alien bodies or wrecked craft and that sort of thing. Like, I mean, if we have those and that comes out, that's great. But it almost seems like that's putting the cart before the horse. We really need to establish: is there something truly anomalous happening in our skies that seems to display some aspects of intelligence? Like, that's the fundamental question that people need to accept before any of this other stuff can go on. And how do you get people to accept that? And that goes to the point you were just making. It's like, depending on who the source is and what their motives are, half to a third to three-quarters of the population immediately is just going to dismiss it right off the top. So
Right.
how do we get consensus? And we haven't found a way to get consensus on anything else, you know?
But that comes back to the point of that we were talking about what the UFO's role in our individual lives. Like, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but I think it's true. Like, the only disclosure that you need comes from you. Like, you have to convince yourself that there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And that's probably a little bit of a journey. You probably are going to have to do some reading, and your opinion is going to change several times over the course of that. But like, once you get to that point, you don't need an authority structure telling you whether or not this stuff exists. So I think that that's an important thing that people can also do, is to just pursue these things themselves. And I'm not saying, quit your day job and, and go like research, old MUFON magazines or old flying saucer reviews for hours at a time. But I'm saying, like, poke around a little bit and see if everything smells right. And
Yeah.
it probably won't. And it probably means that there's something strange going on. And to me, that is disclosure with a small d. It might not be big D disclosure, but it's disclosure with a small d.
Yeah, I will. In my part of this conversation, I was talking with my wife, and I've gotten her into a lot of this stuff. Like, we're on a journey together, but it started with talks on a walk, and she's like, "Oh, really?" And she starts to research, and now she's bringing me stuff that's like way that I totally missed. But she mentioned an interview with Donald Hoffman, and his point was that what people think about the reality has nothing whatsoever to do with what the reality actually is. So we can sit around and argue all day long about whether people are going to believe, or that we need to convince this person or that person that UFOs are real, Bigfoot is real, fairies are real, or whatever. It doesn't change the fact at all of the reality. And so part of it is just, hot air.
Yeah, I mean, so much of existence is just trying to navigate the worldviews of others and make them play nice with our own.
Yeah, yeah.
One of my favorite memes that I've seen, and I mention this regularly, is there's a guy who's like putting nails into the tide on the beach, and the tide says reality, and each nail says language. It's like, yeah, it's kind of it. It's just it's the worldviews are a way to keep ourselves from going mad by how undescribable this entire psychedelic existence is around us.
Well, that's pretty much all I have for you. Joshua, I appreciate you coming on the show and having this conversation. I learned a lot, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and we went in some really fun places, and I really appreciate the level of the conversation that we had. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem, and hopefully I'll have you back sometime.
Sounds great. Absolutely.
All right, thank you so much. Have a good day.
You
All right, Josh. I appreciate it, man. I can't hear you now. Well.
All right,
Thanks so much. That was a blast.
Yeah, no problem. It was great. I mean, I really, really appreciated your books, and I'll be following